Before we get into the story, if you're new here, welcome to Ivory Secrets. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing where our listeners are tuning in from across Canada and beyond. Now, let's get into it. She signed the papers on a Tuesday morning, and he didn't notice until Friday. That was the kind of marriage it had been. Lenora Vane had spent 11 years being invisible in a house that had her name on exactly 0 documents. The mortgage was his. The cars were his. The vacation property in Muskoka, the one she had picked out, driven 3 hours to see, negotiated the price on, and repainted the front porch of with her own hands one August weekend, was his. She had understood early on that in the world of Bennett Ashcroft, things belonged to whoever had the checkbook, and Lenora had kept her checkbook very, very quiet. That was the part people had trouble understanding. Later. Why would a woman like her, a woman with her particular kind of mind, her particular kind of patience, stay silent for so long? The answer was not weakness. It never is. Bennett Ashcroft was 44 years old and had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been surprised by life. He'd built his commercial real estate company, Ashcroft Group, out of a single property in downtown Toronto, and by the time he met Lenora, he had 12 buildings, a feature in Report on Business, and a way of entering a room that made other men straighten their ties. Lenora met him at a charity auction in 2013. She had been there with a colleague from the hospital where she worked, not as a doctor. Bennett would later tell people, as a coordinator, a logistics person, she handled scheduling. He had thought she was pleasant, soft-spoken, pretty in a quiet way that didn't demand anything from you. He had been exactly right and completely wrong at the same time. What Lenora actually was, a woman who had graduated top of her class in health policy from the University of Toronto, who had spent 6 years building a research consultancy on the side, entirely in her own name, entirely off the radar of their shared life. What she did at the hospital was not scheduling. She ran a policy research division that had, over the course of their marriage, produced 3 published studies on regional healthcare infrastructure, 2 of which had been cited in provincial government reports. She had 3 patents pending, not pharmaceutical, but system design patents, the kind that applied to how hospitals managed patient flow across multiple facilities. She had been offered, twice, a position in Ottawa. She turned it down both times. She had never told Bennett any of this, not because she was hiding. Not exactly. In the first year of their marriage, she had tried. She had sat across from him at their dining room table, the one she had chosen, the one he referred to as our table when guests came over, and she had told him about a paper she was working on, a policy framework for rural healthcare access. She had been excited. She remembered being excited. He had listened for about 4 minutes. Then, he had said gently, "The way you say something gently when you don't think you're being unkind. That sounds like a lot of work for something that probably won't go anywhere." She had looked at him across the table. He had gone back to his phone. After that, Lenora had simply stopped telling him things. Not out of strategy, not at first. Just out of the ordinary self-preservation that happens when you learn, quietly and without drama, that the person across from you is not actually listening. The woman's name was Christina. Lenora had known about her for 14 months before she walked out, not suspected, known. She had found the first text message by accident, the old cliché, picking up the wrong phone in the dark of their bedroom. She had read 3 lines and set the phone back down on the nightstand and lain there in the dark for a very long time. She did not confront him that night. She did not confront him the next morning, or the week after, or the month after that. People would ask her, later, why? How could you stay? How could you keep making his coffee and sitting across from him at dinner and acting like everything was fine? And Lenora would take a breath, and she would think about how to explain something that people who haven't lived it rarely understand. She wasn't acting like everything was fine. She was finishing something. She had about 14 months of work left on the 3rd patent application. She had a consultancy contract with a healthcare network in British Columbia that she needed to see through to completion. She had a meeting scheduled with an investment group in Vancouver that she'd been building toward for 2 years. and she had a mother in a care home in Hamilton whose bills Lenora paid out of her own account, an account Bennett had never once asked to see. She was not waiting because she was afraid. She was waiting because she was not yet done. That is a difference that matters. The morning she left, it was raining. One of those gray October rains that comes off Lake Ontario and settles into the city like it belongs there, cold and patient and entirely without apology. Bennett had a work event that evening, a gallery opening for a client. He had mentioned it twice over the past week, both times in the tone of a man who assumed his wife would be there, standing beside him, making conversation with people whose names she'd have to relearn every time. Lenora had confirmed she would come. She had also, the week prior, transferred the last of her personal assets into a holding account registered under Vane Consulting Group, her maiden name, her company, her money. She had signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Roncesvalles. She had retained a family lawyer named Patricia Kwan, who came recommended by 2 people Lenora trusted, and who had, at their first meeting, looked at the documents Lenora laid on the table and said, simply, "You've been thorough." "I've had time," Lenora had said. On the morning of the gallery opening, Lenora woke at 6, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet. Bennett was still asleep. The rain was hitting the window above the sink. The kitchen smelled like the last 11 years, the specific, accumulated scent of a life she had built. Inside someone else's idea of what a life should look like. She drank her. Then she packed the bag she had already packed 2 weeks earlier and placed at the back of the hall closet. And she walked out the front door. She did not leave a note. Patricia Kwan's office would be in touch. She found out about the gallery opening later through a mutual friend who had been there and who texted Lenora 3 days afterward, uncertain, picking her words carefully. "Bennett was there with someone. I didn't know if you knew." I wasn't sure what to say. Lenora read the text on her new phone, in her new apartment, sitting on a second-hand couch she had bought from a woman in Parkdale who was moving to Montreal. The apartment was small and slightly drafty and smelled like fresh paint. There were boxes still stacked along one wall. She texted back, "I knew. Thank you for telling me." She put the phone down and looked at her boxes and thought about what she wanted to hang on the walls. Bennett called on the Friday, 4 days after she'd left. He had apparently come home Thursday evening to find her things gone and an envelope on the kitchen counter from a law firm he didn't recognize. She did not pick up. He called 3 more times that evening. She let them all go to voicemail. His messages went, in order, through the following emotional stages: confusion, irritation, something that was almost concern, and then, by the 4th message, a tight, controlled anger that she recognized from 11 years of living with him. The voice he used when he felt he'd been made to look foolish. She listened to all 4 messages in a row, sitting cross-legged on her second-hand couch, with a cup of tea going cold on the floor beside her. Then she deleted them and called her mother. Her mother, whose name was Adele and who had been living with early-stage dementia for 3 years, and who still, on good days, remembered the sound of Lenora's voice and lit up when she heard it, Adele said, when Lenora told her she had left. "Oh, sweetheart." Finally, Lenora had laughed, the kind of laugh that breaks somewhere in the middle into something else. "I know," she said. "I know. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. Bennett had hired one of the more aggressive family lawyers in the city, a man who operated on the assumption that Lenora's quiet demeanor meant she had nothing to fight with. He was, as it turned out, mistaken about this. When Vane Consulting Group came to light, the patents, the contracts, the British Columbia healthcare deal that had closed 6 months earlier, for a figure that caused a brief silence in the room when Patricia Kwan placed the documents on the table, the atmosphere in the mediation room changed. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of triumph. Lenora did not look across at Bennett when the numbers were read out. She was looking at her own hands folded on the table in front of her. What she heard was the sound of a man recalculating. Bennett's lawyer asked for a recess. They got 20 minutes. Lenora went and got a coffee from the machine in the hallway and stood by the window that looked out over University Avenue. Watching the traffic move in the gray November light, Patricia came and stood beside her. "You could push for more," Patricia said. It wasn't pressure. It was information. I know, Lenora said. I don't want more. I want clean. Patricia nodded once. Then we'll get you clean. What Lenora took from the marriage? The Muskoka property. Not because it was worth the most. It wasn't. She took it because she had driven 3 hours to see it, had stood on that sloping lawn above the lake, and known, in her body, that it was the right place. Because she had repainted the front porch herself in the August heat, with a radio on the railing and the smell of cedar and lake water in the air. Because it was the one thing from 11 years that she had not simply arranged for someone else. She left Bennett, the Toronto house. She left him the cars, the investment portfolio they had, nominally shared, the furniture she had chosen. She did not fight over any of it. She asked for the Muskoka property, a single piece of artwork that had belonged to her grandmother, and a settlement figure that Patricia Kwan had arrived at, and that was modest enough that Bennett's lawyer accepted it without counteroffer, which meant he had expected worse. The night the settlement was finalized, Lenora called her mother again. Adele was having a harder day. She couldn't quite place Lenora's voice at first. But when Lenora said, "Mayman, it's me, it's finished," something in Adele's voice shifted, went softer, the way it did when she was reaching for something she could almost touch. "Good," Adele said quietly. "You can breathe now." Lenora had to press her hand over her mouth for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, I can." The BC contract had led to 3 others, 2 healthcare networks in Alberta, a provincial consultation in Manitoba. By the time the divorce was finalized, Vane Consulting had 4 full-time employees and 2 part-time researchers. And Lenora was in conversation with a policy think tank in Ottawa about a long-term research partnership. She moved to the Muskoka property that spring. Not permanently. She kept a small place in the city, but for the first time in her adult life, she had a place that was entirely hers, that bore her actual name on the deed, that she could sit on the porch of in the early morning with coffee and hear exactly nothing but birds and the water. She had forgotten what quiet actually sounded like. Not the quiet of a house where you'd stopped talking to each other. Not the quiet of 11 years of managed invisibility. Real quiet, the kind that holds you instead of pressing down on you. She painted the porch, railing again that first May. A slightly different shade of white. She stood back and looked at it and decided she liked it better. She heard about Bennett through the ordinary channels, that people hear things, a mutual acquaintance, a mention in a business newsletter, a friend who still moved in the same circles and who passed along information without agenda. The way people do when they're trying to be kind. Christina, apparently, had ended things shortly after the settlement. Lenora had not been surprised by this. Christina had been attracted, from what Lenora could piece together, to a version of Bennett that his professional life had made possible, the events, the properties, the ease of a man whose decisions didn't seem to cost him anything. A divorce, even a relatively clean one, has a way of making the cost visible. Bennett, she heard, had gone quiet for a while. He was still running Ashcroft Group, still closing deals, still the same man in most of the ways that counted. But something in him had shifted, she was told. He'd become more measured in rooms, less quick to fill silences. She didn't know what to do with that information, so she filed it away and went back to her work. The thing nobody tells you about leaving a life you've outgrown is that the leaving is only part of it. The harder part is the space afterward. The mornings when you wake up in your own place, in the right place, and feel the full weight of how long you waited. And you have to decide what to do with that weight. Lenora had made her choice. She carried it the way she carried most things, not by putting it down and pretending it wasn't there, but by keeping it with her and moving anyway. She was not unscathed. She knew that. She had loved Bennett, in the beginning, in the way you love someone when you're 32. And the world seems legible and the future seems like something you can plan. She had loved him when she sat across from him at the dining room table and tried to tell him about her work. The grief of that, of the version of the marriage she had wanted and not had, was real and she didn't pretend otherwise. But grief and regret are different things. She had the first. She did not have the second. The following spring, her paper on multi-site patient flow optimization was published in a journal. she had been working toward for years. It was picked up by 3 provincial health ministries. She gave a presentation at a conference in Calgary that ran 20 minutes over time because the questions kept coming. And the moderator finally had to physically intervene. And the room had laughed, and Lenora had laughed. And afterward, a researcher from McGill had found her in the hallway and said, simply, "That was the best thing I've heard in 2 years. Can I buy you a coffee?" She had said yes. They had talked for 2 hours in the hotel lobby. About work, about the state of rural health care, about a collaborative project he was trying to get funded, about the particular satisfaction of seeing something you built actually function in the world. On the train back to Toronto, she sat by the window and watched the Albertan landscape go past. Flat and enormous and lit up gold in the afternoon, and she felt something that took her a moment to name. It was not happiness. Exactly, though it was close to that. It was the feeling of being known by the right things, of being in the exact room she was supposed to be in, doing exactly the work she was built for, known by people who saw her clearly. She had not felt that in 11 years. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass of the train window and closed her eyes. She thought about the porch, the white railing, the water below the lawn in the early morning. She thought about her mother's voice saying, "You can breathe now." She exhaled slowly all the way, and the train carried her home. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from, or tell me which part of Lenora's story hit closest to home. And if you're new to Ivory Secrets, please subscribe. There are more stories coming, and you don't want to miss them.